But what happened, he said, I can smell Millwall in here. So one of my mates from Peckham, older guy, he said, what are we standing here for? Let's get on with it. Let's get it. And everyone went, have some of this, pull tools out. They pulled tools out. It went mental. As someone wasn't killed.
In the late 90s, the Horseshoe pub was a stronghold for Millwall's notorious football casuals. Drinking, sniffing and banter was a regular occurrence. The pub was packed on the night in question, and the atmosphere was electric with weekend buzz. But while Millwall's firm revelled in stories of bravado and sexual conquests, a far darker plan was being set in motion. At a discreet location, a small group of professional criminals gathered. Led by a well-known South London villain, they prepared for a night of retribution. Among them was a dangerous figure from the East End, a man with a deadly reputation, who calmly loaded a pistol for the job ahead. This wasn't about rivalry, it was about revenge, and in just a few hours, the streets would bear the weight of violence that no one saw coming. The stigma of violence attached to Millwall can be traced back over 110 years. Originally located in the East End of London, the club moved to the infamous Den in 1910, New Cross, South London. Despite the move, many of the Isle of Dogs faithful remained loyal to their club and continued to follow the Lions. In the 70s, Millwall saw the rise of a more organised hooligan group called the F Troop, which would morph into the Bushwhackers and would become one of the most feared grounds to travel to in the country.
All we're going for, like a good game of football, a good punch up and a good kiss up. That's all about Millwall.
How not too bad, Harry.
Is that more important than the football? No, nothing's more important. Well, it's about equal. If I want a Millwall support, I wouldn't go down a bit. Everyone carries the talk.
Harry the dog, who, having hitchhiked to the ground, had staged an unsuccessful solo attack on the Bristol end.
Millwall's firm would drink down the Old Kent Road at that time, and the hardcore would live in areas like Peckham, Woolworth, Bermondsey and Deptford, a small community that knew each other well and helped form a no backward step mentality. To be seen as a runner and a coward in a Millwall stronghold was not an option.
Do you get in so many rucks, Billy?
You get a lot of geese taking a piss at you at football. They turn round and they start shouting things at you, chanting at you, you know what I mean? And you just lose your temper.
But why do you allow yourself to be provoked by the other team's fans? You don't have to fight, do you?
Well, what are you going to be called, a coward? You don't want people to turn around and say, what's up with him? Like, you know what I mean? He's not steaming in. Look at him over there. He's a coward, which does happen.
Like many football firms across the country, a certain section of Millwall's mob was involved in underworld activity, from robbery, dealing, security, and high-level organised crime. On this occasion, I'm told it was not football-related, but involved some of Millwall's top lads. And on the opposing side were heavy South London villains, assisted by two dangerous gangsters from the East End. This violent clash happened at the Horseshoe pub before 1997 and stemmed from a fallout between two serious criminal figures and Millwall hooligans. It was serious enough for the old-school gangster involved to call up a couple of friends from East London who had extremely violent reputations. One of the men was a former soldier, Billy Gale. Gale would go on to be a suspect in the Essex Boys murders. He was put in the frame by his old friend Billy Jasper, but the police rejected the confession from Jasper. Gale's life would come to a premature end in October 1997 in a tragic car crash that killed 4 innocent passengers in another car. On the revenge mission that night, there was a small firm of around 5 or 6 dangerous faces from South and East London. Many are still active to this day, so cannot be mentioned. In the capital cities, underbelly associations were formed from across all corners of London, and there was not a divide like in the Richardson and Cray era, especially with major crime moving from the pavement, armed robberies, to drug importation. There was a need to form allegiances with villains off the plot who could share the cost of big shipments and pool contacts and resources.
In British gangland history that have earned money, we were probably the first generation that pulled out of going on the pavement, moved away from protection as such, and moved into the drugs game. That's where everyone who was anyone earned their money in the 80s, and you became untouchable.
So it is no shock that East and South London villains would team up to take on the Millwall lads who had upset one of the gang. The firm made their way to the pub and did not waste any time in bursting through the doors, hunting for the men who they were going to do serious damage.
No one likes us! No one likes us! No one
The Millwall lads were packed in the pub, and as soon as they saw the group pointing at them, they knew it was on and armed themselves with anything at hand and began approaching the unwanted visitors. The men in front of them may have been heavy, but so were they, and it was their manner, so they were not going to back down from a violent encounter. That was until the East Londoner pulled a shooter out and aimed at the crowd, firing several times, which sent the whole scene into chaos, with the Millwall lads understandably scattering and running for safety. As they tried to evacuate the pub, they were battered by the gang, who got to work with bats, bars and knives, smashing every Millwall or punter in their way. There was no mercy. I'm told one man got shot in the leg and another possibly got winged, and there was a brutal beating dished out to many of the Millwall crew that night. One of the main Millwall men, who was recently on a podcast, escaped and was allegedly running for his life with the shooter, lining him up in his sights, but fortunately, he didn't manage to hit him. The whole incident was extremely violent, and I can only imagine the initial fallout was over something quite substantial for such drastic action. But I do know all the men involved were or are heavy faces, and although Gale and the shooter were aligned with a West Ham firm, this was not football related as mentioned earlier. The incident was not investigated by the police and was kept in-house, and to my knowledge, there was no retaliation from Millwall's firm. I have kept the names of the living out from the attackers, for obvious reasons, but was given permission to relay the story. This is only one side of the version, by somebody who was involved. I'm sure Millwall may have a slightly differing version, as is always the case with events so many years ago. This encounter is another example of how a wrong move within the underworld, and you can be sipping a pint, unaware that a plot is in progress to have you wiped off the face of the earth. Many of the men who feature in true crime books or podcasts have created terrible suffering for their victims, but also for their own lives and families, who have no choice but to suffer the consequences. Some people grow up with a criminal mindset, but the majority are products of their environments with an overwhelming desire to break out of the cycle of poverty by any means necessary. Thankfully, in this incident, no one was fatally wounded, but I thought it was a good, untold story of London's violent underworld. I look forward to reading your comments. A big thank you for the support, and to all new and original subs who keep the show rolling on. Until next time, the Inquirer out.